The following audio was taken from Jordan Peterson's exchange with Susan Blackmore, titled, "Do We Need God to Make Sense of Life?"
See, I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble and that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, for example, which I think is a doomed enterprise.
Mr. Peterson basically says that he believes the Bible is foundational to civilization. In comparison, there are some people who believe that the Quran is foundational to civilization. But this doesn't make their belief true. The question is not what one believes, but why they believe it. What makes their belief intelligent? In the case of the Bible, there are self-evidently many moral propositions that Peterson would reject, such as Deuteronomy chapter 22. And I quote, "If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her." Clearly, Peterson would not be able to endorse this as an intelligent moral standard for society. And this is precisely because he has a humanistic standard by which he judges the Bible. Peterson has no choice but to condemn this as primitive and ignorant. Even if he decides to restructure the passage through interpretation, thereby violently bending it to his humanism, the point would stand. He rejects the idea that this is an intelligent moral procedure for dealing with rape, and we most assuredly agree with him. And he rejects this because he has a set of ethics based on contemporary knowledge, a set of ethics by which he stands above the archaic values of religion and passes moral judgment on their intelligence. The most important point that is easy to miss in Peterson's presentation is when he says, and I quote, "Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, it will inevitably crumble, and it will be replaced by something that is perhaps far worse. Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his own psyche, which I think is a doomed enterprise." There are a few important criticisms to make here. In the first place, Mr. Peterson assumes that the Bible is the moral cornerstone of civilization, which is patent nonsense. Civilization has made progress as its values have departed from the primatology of religion. This is a fact. Religion, at one point, did help to take man from a more primitive state to a more civilized one, but we are far beyond that primitive state. Religion is the new primatology. Religion couldn't do in 5,000 years what science has done in only 200 years. All our advances in agriculture, medicine, cosmology, child development, engineering have not been the result of religion, but the result of progress within the domain of the social sciences. The more we depart from superstition in the direction of intelligence, the more promise we nourish for the prospect of a stable society. Christianity, for all its so-called ethical value, never discovered one scintilla of what psychology has discovered about the well-being of humans and society in the last 100 years. Most specifically, attachment theory, neurobiology, social psychology, developmental psychology, and man's newfound understanding of the havoc that trauma inflicts on the human system. The second point here is the crucial one, and it's downright devastating, so please listen carefully. Mr. Peterson said, Nietzsche hoped Christian morality, would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche, which I think is a doomed enterprise. Never mind the fact that Nietzsche would never agree to the notion of spontaneity that Peterson attributes to him. It was Nietzsche's intelligent desire to reconstruct human values on the basis of an accurate ontology, as opposed to a projected, reactionary superstition that formed values in response to its own existential fear. The real problem is that Peterson calls this act of value formation a doomed enterprise. But my friends, what exactly does he think religious values are constructed from? Are they not constructed from the only thing they can be constructed from? That of the human psyche? Peterson's naivety about the nature of Christian values manifests that he is being deceived and manipulated by his own psyche. This manipulation, which seems to function as a kind of automation, induces him to believe that religious values have some other origin than that of the human mind. How can it be that this celebrated public intellectual of psychology is not even aware of his own psyche acting on the premise of his belief? Can one be a liberator of others if they remain unconscious of their own enslavement? To repeat one more time, the Christian values that Peterson is referring to are products of the human psyche, but they are not self-consciously constructed values. They are concepts that have their origin in existential fear. Peterson must do more than simply assert that Christian values are not based on the human psyche, that they proceed from some transcendent realm. This is something he must prove. But as it stands, this is just an empty, unconscious assertion of which Peterson himself isn't even aware. So here's the vital point in defense of Nietzsche and self-consciously constructed intelligent values. There is nothing doomed about the human construction of values. This negative proclamation is itself the product of the error of those who attempt to smuggle in a set of supernatural values, thereby creating a false dichotomy by which to condemn reality, creating a false dichotomy by which to condemn non-religious values, as though religious values were distinct from the human psyche. This tactic amounts to the fallacy of special pleading. My friends, because all values are constructed, because all values proceed from the human mind in one form or another, this means we can construct better values, and have been doing so for thousands of years. This is precisely why Peterson, for example, must reject the archaic values of Deuteronomy chapter 22. This is why we no longer embrace spanking children, which is clearly taught in the Bible, because we know better. Attachment theory informs us of what happens to a child's development when they are introduced to the world through violence. In this respect, if you want to read real psychologists, as opposed to Peterson's strongman, charlatan cult of personality, look up the work of Alan Shore and Peter Fonagy, two tremendous researchers within the domain of psychology. If Peterson believes non-religious value construction is a doomed enterprise, then let him show that Christian values are not the result of the human psyche. By making this claim, he has incurred a tremendous burden of proof, by indirectly inferring that religious values have some other origin than that of the human mind. The crucial point, my friends, is that we don't have to live in the stupidity of the values of the past. As time progresses, so have the intelligence of our values. And we can only hope that this progress continues to win the day, because there are many regressionists like Peterson that long to cast the world into primitive darkness. And this is really what holding on to the past is about for these regressionists. It's about trying to cope with existential fear by clinging to what appears familiar, by clinging to what brings one a psychological feeling of safety. What bothers me the most about men like Peterson is that young people see him as an intellectual example, as someone who has real answers, when in fact his program is really just an exercise in self-assertion and conformity at the expense of disciplined thought.